Hello, friends. This is the first part of a series of Bible studies. As we cannot meet easily now in these Corona days, I decided to offer you a series of Bible studies online. Uh, you don't have to watch it; you have power over me. Um, the series I want to do is about the temples of God in the Bible. Now, you may never have thought of that concept, and I must admit, until a couple of years ago, this was new for me. Uh, the Bible is full of temple language, much more than you imagine. And today I like to start with a 20-minute study on the creation in Genesis 1 as God building a temple. The Bible opens with the sentence, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Genesis 1, verse 1. That's the beginning of the Bible. In the very end of the Bible, you find the revelation of St. John, and there we read that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 21, verse 1. I will not give you time to look up these Bible references, but you can at any time, of course, click me and stop me so that you have time to read and check that what I'm saying is actually correct. Well, the Bible sees all of history as a journey of humankind between the two bookends of creation at the beginning and the bookend of recreation in the end. And the heart of the stories of creation and recreation and the heart of the story of humankind in the Bible is presented to us as the search for the presence of God among his people. In the vision of John, of that new heaven and the new earth, we read that he hears a voice. The voice says, "Behold, the tent of God is with man, and he will dwell with them. And they will be his people, and God himself will be with them, and he will be their God." Revelation 21, verse 3. Now that is clearly temple language. By that I mean language that refers to Israel's temple in Jerusalem, or more generally, to a place where God dwells, a location. The new heaven and the new earth will be like a temple to God, and mankind will enjoy it as God's own people. That's a wonderful idea. Now, in that temple, man is the perfect image of God. I will return to this idea later, that man is an image in the temple of God. But I want to already point you to the fact that this is temple language, because an image, a statue, an icon is actually temple language. Man is presented as a statue in God's temple. John writes also about the New Jerusalem that descends from heaven to earth, and then he says, "I saw no temple in her, for the Lord God Almighty is her temple, and the Lamb. And the city does not need the sun and the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God illuminates it, and the Lamb is its lamp." Revelation 21, verse 22 and 23. Again, temple language. The glory of God that is mentioned refers to the fire and the cloud that was seen above and in the temple, in the tabernacle, and later in the temple of Solomon. You can find that in Exodus 40, 1 Kings 9, and again Revelation 22, verse 1 and 2. Now that Christ is called the Lamb refers to the sacrifices in the temple. And given the context, I think that the word lamp that is used, that Christ is the lamp, should be reminiscent of the menorah, the seven-armed candlestick that provided the holy part of the tabernacle in the temple with its light. Temple language. And John's description of the recreation is clearly the counterpart to the account of the original creation in Genesis. I come back to this later when I discuss a recreation. But for the moment, it is sufficient to point out that John sees in this recreation that there is a tree of life. That is one of the many themes from the creation story that come back in the revelation of John when he describes the recreation. Now, a thought. If the second bookend, that is the description of the recreation, if that refers to and builds on themes of the first bookend of creation. And if this recreation is clearly presented as a temple of God, then it makes very good sense to think that the first bookend of creation is also presented to us as a temple. Now, this is confirmed by many other passages in the Bible. And I think this is the correct way to read the account of Genesis 1, of creation. But as I mentioned, the correct way to read, this is of course an issue. How do we read? How do we understand? The Apostle Paul writes to Timothy, in 2 Timothy 3, verse 16 and 17, that all scriptures are inspired by God and useful for teaching, for refuting, for improving, and educating us in righteousness, that the man who belongs to God may be perfect, for every good work fully equipped. That is the goal of the Holy Scriptures, that we become better people. Genesis 1 is part of that scripture, so what Paul says about Holy Scriptures in general should also inform our attitude and expectation when we read Genesis. Genesis was inspired by God, and it is useful for us, and it serves to make us better people. Genesis 1 is written for us, yes, but not written to us. And that's an important difference. It was written to people 3,000 years ago in the ancient Near East. Ancient Near East is a technical term. It is used for the area of roughly the Middle East and Turkey and Persia or Iran between the 6th millennium before Christ and for the 4th century before Christ. So a long stretch of time in that particular area. That area really was one culture. In many aspects, they shared the same worldview. The fact that it's changed after the 4th century before Christ is because then the Greek concept of Hellenism started to pervade the Middle East and really changed the cultural outlook of people. But Genesis 1 was written in a time when that ancient Near East, the worldview of the ancient Near East was prevalent. And the exact dating of Genesis, some people make a big issue of it, whether it is 1400 before Christ or 700 before Christ. Well, that may have all sorts of important ramifications, but I think for understanding Genesis 1, it doesn't make much difference, because it was, broadly speaking, written to people with the same cultural worldview, the same outlook of life. And as a historian, I'm also not very interested in questions of editorial history of Genesis. I find that too speculative. I prefer to deal with the final product that we have in our hand now as it is. And that was used by Israel long before Christ came. So to understand all this, to understand what the text means, we must not look at that text in the first place with the questions of today. We must first ask ourselves, what did Genesis 1 actually mean for the readers then? With what questions, with what sort of worldview did those people look at the text? What did Genesis mean for them? By the way, that is not to say that the text cannot teach us new things that were not clear long before the coming of Christ. We read the Bible from the heart of salvation revealed in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Also something that we will come back later to. But nowadays in our time, we are extremely interested in scientific knowledge about the origins of the world. How did everything come about? How did it happen? Was there evolution? For the first readers of Genesis, this was really not how they listened or looked at that text. They were much more interested in how the world works, how the order in the world can be maintained, how we as human beings have to act in order to make the sun go up and in order to make harvests come and go, seasons come and go. They had a much more practical way of looking at it. Now, that approach is much closer to how Paul wrote to Timothy about the purpose of scriptures. It is to help us in our life. An important difference in worldview between then and now is also that nowadays we really tend to understand our world as a sort of machine. It is well oiled, it runs by itself. There's no magic. There's no. Many people say, well, there may be a God who once started all this, but he created it to run by itself, and God is maybe too far away. No more magic. And if you believe in this natural worldview, well, then you are very, very distant in your mind from those people who received Genesis 1. If you believe that there is more than this natural world, you believe in the supernatural, something that goes beyond the natural world. Well, if you would have mentioned this to people who read the Genesis 1 3,000 years ago, they would think you are crazy. Sorry to say, but they would think this. They would probably not even understand the concept of the division between nature and supernature, because the whole world was seen as spiritual. This whole cosmos was seen as magical. God or the gods, they were everywhere, and nothing happened without them. If those gods would take their hands off this world, everything would collapse. Against this background, the story of Genesis has to be read. Now, the Bible regularly compares the universe to God's temple. For instance, Isaiah was very clear in this. The prophet Isaiah wrote after the Temple of Solomon was destroyed, and many people were extremely upset. And he said, why? Why are you so upset? He says, thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and earth is the footstool for my feet. Where then would be the house that you would build for me, and where the place of my rest? Isaiah 66 verse 1. So Isaiah says, heaven and earth together are the place where God rests, where he resides. God doesn't need a stone house to be worshipped. God already has a temple, is what Isaiah says. He has a resting place. A resting place for the gods. That is what temples in the ancient Near East were. We see an example of this in Psalm 132 verse 12 and 13. There we read, for the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it as his home. This is, he says, my resting place forever. Here I will dwell. The temple is presented as God's resting place and his residence, where he lives. And those two terms are used as synonyms here. So, going back to Genesis 1, should we maybe consider the seventh day on which God rested from all his works as an indication that he was now taking up his residence in the temple of creation? He had finished his construction work and he could now live there. Well, this is, for instance, how John Walton, a professor in Old Testament at Wheaton College in Chicago, reads this text. He says, any reader, Israelite or not, would have understood that when Genesis speaks of God's rest, this is about the temple, because this is the place where God rests and where the gods rest, and that is why temples were built. And Walton believes that readers of the Genesis text in the ancient Near East would immediately have recognized the temple language. He says this, without hesitation, the ancient reader would have concluded that this is a temple text. And he gives then many examples of extra biblical texts from that time that show that in the ancient times in the Middle East, temple and cosmos were seen as each other's mirror image. Temples were built and considered to be a microcosm. I have regularly visited temples and graves in Egypt, the pharaonic temples. They are spectacular. Often you see very colorful images on the ceilings, on the walls, on the columns. On the ceilings you see stars and the sun and the moon. On the walls you see plants and trees and people. And these temples functioned as a model of the cosmos. in which the floor depicted the earth and the ceiling depicted the sky, and the columns and the wall decorations represented everything that lives on earth. And I can add, often they represented the gods. And the Genesis story shows that God just made that. God just made all these things that you in Egypt or in Babylon consider gods. That's a mistake. God created everything, one God. These temples were, according to the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann, for the Egyptians, they were nothing short of the world that was filled by Almighty God to its utmost limits with His presence. The Egyptian temple was the universe, and images in the temple, such as those of the god Ra or the cat god Basset, they were all part of the pantheon of gods and demigods that were worshipped all over the Middle East. By the way, I think that it is reasonable to read Genesis 1 to 3 from the perspective of the Egyptian cosmology, not necessarily in the light of Babylonian cosmology, as is often done, although it doesn't matter much because, as I said, the worldview in that region in those days was very similar. Now, Geoffrey Morrow, a Roman Catholic theologian in New Jersey, he agrees with this view of temples in antiquity. He wrote an article in which he says that temples throughout the ancient Near East had cosmological connotations, and temples were places where the gods rested. Now you may think, well, that was those pagan temples, but what about the temples in Israel? Well, the tabernacle and the temple had the same meaning. They represented the universe. Let me quote one example. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He wrote a book after the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 called The Jewish War. And in that book he describes the destruction of the temple that was destroyed in the year 70. And of the objects in the temple, he says, each of those objects is intended to bring the universe into mind and to represent it. So Israel in the days of Jesus saw the temple as a representation of the universe. That the tabernacle and the temple were seen as an allegorical microcosm actually also suggests, of course, the exact opposite. The cosmos, as described in the creation story, contains elements that reminded the Israelites of their temple. And whether the temple or the creation story is primary does not influence the conclusion that the creation story was seen as temple building. Now, if it was temple building, you would expect certain things. The custom in the ancient Near East to describe the construction of temples in terms of sevens, 7 days, 7 things, means that we are not surprised at all that in Genesis 1 we also see lots of sevens. Morrow shows how a pattern of sevens plays an important role in the creation story, far beyond the fact that it was in 7 days. He shows how many sentences, for instance, in Genesis 1 consist of multiples of 7 words. He points to the fact that the tabernacle was dedicated in 7 days, and that the temple of Solomon was built in 7 years. So the listener to the Genesis story immediately recognized aspects that were normally seen as typical of the construction of a tabernacle or a temple. And Morrow points out to some interesting linguistic correspondence between creation and the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus 39 and 40. Let me read 5 examples. Genesis 1 and Exodus 39. And God saw all that he had made, and Moses saw all the work, and behold, that's how they made it. Genesis 2 and Exodus 39. Thus heaven and earth are completed. Thus all the work on the tabernacle was completed. Genesis 2 and Exodus 40. when God completed his work that he had made, so Moses completed the work. Genesis 2 and Exodus 39. And God blessed. Then Moses blessed. Genesis 2, and Exodus 40. And God sanctified, sanctifying the altar. So the construction of the universe or the construction of the tabernacle were described as the mirror of the other. The Anglican theologian N.T. Wright concluded therefore also that in Genesis 1, creation is described as a temple. It is built as temples were built in the ancient Near East. And it is important in this regard that most creation stories, and there were many in the ancient Near East, most of those stories ended with the building of a temple for the gods who were involved in creation. The absence of any temple building as a place of worship in the biblical description of creation is very remarkable. Readers in the ancient Near East would have thought, where is the temple? Where's the building? But it's also logical that it's not there, because the universe is viewed as the perfect temple of God. No separate temple was needed. So the biblical creation story is very different here from the stories of the nations around Israel. God created a temple in which he could dwell, and mankind was allowed to share in that house as the image of God. That is something interesting to consider. The role of mankind. We will come back to that later. Man as an image of God. According to Morrow, creation unfolded itself, how it is described, as a cosmic liturgical celebration that culminated in the seventh day when God rested in his creation. And it is the carefully constructed structure of Genesis, with all the sevens in it, linking it to the temple in Jerusalem, that made many theologians, like the people that I quoted, suggest that maybe Genesis 1 was actually used as a liturgical text in the Temple of Jerusalem to celebrate maybe an annual festival to remind Israel of the parallel between creation and temple. That's a very nice idea, but there is no shred of evidence for it. Let me finish with two questions, or two things to consider. First, what is more attractive for you? To see our world as a machine that sort of runs by itself, oiled very well, or to see it as a magical palace, a temple of God where he is intimately present in his creation? And a second thought, I will come back later to this, but think about it. What is the role of Adam and Eve, image of God, in that temple? Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, feel very free to contact me. And I hope to see you in the next program. Thank you.